The Ukrainian war brings to light the rifts between the Russian army and the Kremlin administration. This war on the territory of Eastern Europe is burying Vladimir Putin's senior officials in the dusty pages of history. Since the beginning of the war, Russian leader Vladimir Putin has dismissed key generals without hesitation. This trend, which started last March with the dismissal of 8 generals due to poor intelligence and wrong strategy, continues in 2023. High-ranking figures such as Dmitry Bulgakov, General Muratov, and General Mikhail Zaintsov are among the commanders that Vladimir Putin has recently discredited. Let's get to know the commanders that Mr. Putin has dismissed in recent days. The Russian army has replaced its highest-ranking general in charge of logistics ahead of an anticipated counterattack by Kiev. The dismissal of Colonel General Mikhail Zaintsov comes after Russia's offensive in eastern Ukraine faltered due to ongoing problems with ammunition supplies. Zaintsov was nicknamed the Butcher of Mariupol by the Ukrainian authorities due to the general's role in the attack. This naming was approved by the UK government. Western analysts have questioned whether he was responsible for the city's destruction, including attacks on a maternity hospital, as he was head of the National Defense Administration Center in Moscow at the time. The Russian Defense Ministry did not comment. However, influential Russian military bloggers criticized his dismissal. So who is Colonel Mikhail Zaintsov? Colonel Zaintsov, 60, was promoted to Deputy Defense Minister in September and became responsible for logistics. Zaintsov replaced General Dmitry Bulgakov, who was dismissed due to supply line malfunctions during the initial invasion of Ukraine. With his white hair and icy pale blue eyes, Colonel Zaintsov is one of the few Russian army generals with any profile in the West. Allegedly, Zaintsov oversaw Russia's brutal bombardment of Aleppo during the Syrian civil war. The National Defense Headquarters, which Colonel Zaintsov directed until September 20, 2022, coordinates the Russian army's response to the events. The National Defense Headquarters houses a supercomputer designed to predict the outcome of conflicts and the development of rival armies. Russian soldiers fighting in the vicinity of Bakhmut in Ukraine's Donbass region complained that their artillery supply was running low. Soldiers mobilized into the Russian army stated that their equipment was substandard. Zaintsov was blamed for the logistical inadequacy of the soldiers. Vladimir Putin dismissed Zaintsov. So far, no official reason has been given for the dismissal of Colonel Zaintsov. However, some analysts suggest that the colonel's dissatisfaction with his job was the reason for leaving. It is known that the Russian Ministry of Defense is one of the key departments responsible for ensuring the national defense and security of the country. The departure of Mikhail Zaintsov from his post may affect the work of the ministry as a whole and the implementation of state defense orders. Possible changes could undermine the coordination of logistics, processes, and interaction between Department of Defense units. The current resignation may not be the only one, according to a number of Russian military experts. On the other hand, the chaos in the Russian army has been going on for a long time. The reason for this chaos is a series of humiliating defeats on the front lines. Vladimir Putin is used to blaming these defeats on top commanders from the first day of the war. The Russian leader never admitted that he made the wrong strategic moves. Vladimir Putin blamed his own mistakes on the generals. This situation of senior Russian commanders could be summed up as scapegoats. One of these scapegoats is Admiral Sergei Avakov, the commander of Russia's Pacific Fleet, was dismissed a week after the surprise inspection. The change was announced a week after the Pacific Fleet was ordered to conduct surprise combat exercises to repel a theoretical enemy landing. A senior Navy commander refused to send any more of his men to the war in Ukraine. Thereupon, it was claimed that the admiral was fired by Vladimir Putin. Admiral Sergei Avakov, 66, was the commander of Russia's Pacific Fleet before his sudden dismissal from his post last week. Russia's Pacific Fleet, stationed in the port of Vladivostok, did not comment on the reshuffle. Avakint was appointed commander of Russia's Pacific Fleet in May 2012. He was awarded the rank of military admiral on December 13, 2014. Avakint was awarded medals for his service in the Russian army. When Avakint received marching orders from the Kremlin, he was participating in war games involving nuclear bombers. But a defense ministry source insisted that the admiral had decided to retire after a long and distinguished career. The source tried to downplay the significance of the admiral's dismissal. Putin's envoy, Yuri Tritenev, stated that 65-year-old Admiral Sergei Avakint was appointed head of a group responsible for military sports education and patriotic education. In short, the chaos in the Russian army is trying to be solved by dismissing high-level officials. These ruptures in the army are wearing down Vladimir Putin a lot, while Putin can't even find a solution to the problems within the army. He is left with bigger issues. Are the explosions on the Kremlin preparing the end of the Russian leader? The explosions took place in the dome of Sandansky Dvorets in the Kremlin. Video footage released on social media platforms showed that 2 explosions occurred over the Kremlin 15 minutes apart earlier today. The video shows a drone approaching the dome and then exploding in a fireball lighting up the sky. It seems that this drone did not hit the dome itself, however, it exploded very close to the dome, causing burning debris to fall. Photos from another video show 2 drone strikes, one at 2:17 am, and the other at 2:43. Moscow residents noted that the sound of the explosion could be heard from the opposite side of the Moscow River. According to the Yakima main Telegram channel, at the same time, these explosions ignited the blame duel between Russia and Ukraine. Russia claimed that the Ukrainian government carried out a drone strike. The Kremlin described it as a deliberate attempt to attack President Vladimir Putin's residence, which was blocked by Russian electronic warfare systems. Russia did not publish any evidence that Ukraine was behind the explosions. Ukraine claimed that Russia fabricated the incident to divert attention from Ukraine's impending counterattack. The Kiev administration denied any intervention. An attack on the heart of Moscow represents a bold move by Kiev that has the potential to have serious repercussions. US intelligence agencies were still trying to determine what had happened. According to 2 American officials briefed on the situation, U.S. officials have expressed concerns in the past about Ukrainian attacks on Russian soil. Officials were concerned that these attacks might provoke Moscow without a direct impact on the battlefield. It was also clear that whatever the source of the explosions, the Kremlin made a deliberate choice to publicize the event. About 12 hours after the explosions, Mr. Putin's press service released a rare 5-paragraph statement. In the statement, it was claimed that the Kiev regime was trying to kill the president by using drones. Mr. Putin's spokesman said the president was not in the Kremlin when the blast occurred around 2:30 am. Moscow time. If the explosions were truly a drone strike, penetrating the air defenses in central Moscow would have represented the last embarrassing failure of the Russian military. In any case, the incident could be a pretext for Mr. Putin to launch new attacks on Ukraine, as happened in the aftermath of Russia's fiery attack on the Crimean Bridge last October. Ukraine maintained a policy of largely deliberate uncertainty over whether it played a role in the attacks inside Russia. In recent explosions, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has directly denied responsibility. It seems that as long as the Ukrainian war continues, chaos will increase both in the Russian army and within the Kremlin administration. We will wait and see how Vladimir Putin will intervene in this chaos. Russians started focusing on destroying everything that moved in and out of Bakhmut. They increased drone reconnaissance to spot movements, the concentrated artillery fire, and they moved in mortars closer to the contact line. Nonetheless, Ukrainian losses in vehicles suddenly dropped over the last 2 days, and Russian commanders started raising the alarm that Ukrainians are staying in because they prepared a massive counterattack. Last time I told you that Ukrainians managed to impose beneficial for them urban fighting by partially withdrawing and creating a vacuum that Russians tried to fill in and capitalize on. I also told you that Ukrainians put a lot of effort into preserving the corridor for withdrawal by launching a series of limited counterattacks, but also by extensive air strikes with assault helicopters. The freshest report suggests that these efforts are not enough because Russians have improved their fire control over the retreat roads. When Russians had just advanced into the area, they were still using only artillery to hit the roads in the fields. Later, Russians started to use drones to correct their fire to make sure that they accurately target these small roads. And Russians also brought mortars closer to the contact line. That is why 5 to 6 days ago, the number of vehicles hit during the process of withdrawal noticeably increased. Russian sources reported that Ukrainians responded by shifting to only using the roads at night in order to constrain the spotting of the convoys. Ukrainians are also using very small groups of 5 to 8 vehicles that they launch at random times. Such tactic not only decreases the probability of being spotted, but also requires the Russians to expend significantly more shells to be effective. Unfortunately, the Russians manage to catch some vehicles every day, even in the most unconventional places such as forest areas. But over the last 2 days, based on Russian reports, Ukrainian losses of cars and armor have suddenly decreased by more than 50%. Military analysts are offering 3 plausible explanations. Firstly, as discussed in the previous report, Ukrainians have reinforced their flanks and assumed an active defense position, meaning that they have started conducting limited counterattacks whenever possible instead of just staying in their position waiting to defend against the next attack. This limited counterattacks have reportedly pushed Russians a little bit back, which reduced their possibilities of using drones. But even more importantly, mortars. Secondly, after Ukrainians started slowly withdrawing from the eastern bank of the river and southern parts of the city, Russians may have concentrated their efforts on developing their success here. Such actions required constant artillery support, which was granted at the expense of fire control over the roads leading out of Bakhmut. In fact, today, geolocated footage confirmed that Russians gained 1 more street north of their positions and 1 street west of their positions. Lastly, after seeing a huge spike in vehicle losses, Ukrainians may have put some limitations on the use of roads for some time while they are preparing to take greater measures for widening the corridor and reducing Russian fire control. In fact, after the head of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, drew the attention of Russian military analysts to the offensive groups that Ukrainians are forming in the Donetsk region, many started to evaluate a Ukrainian counterattack in this region as a possibility. The main reason why Ukrainians suddenly obtained an opportunity for a counter-offensive here is simple. Wagner forces have stretched the front line to the verge of their ability to hold it, which is the same thing that happened prior to the Ukrainian counter-offensive in the Kharkiv region. The fact of the matter is, over the last 2 months, the area of responsibility of Wagner forces increased from 30 kilometers to more than 60 kilometers, while their forces have shrunk because the Russian Ministry of Defense forbade them to recruit prisoners. That is why Wagner's had to firstly put on hold their offensive towards Siversk and later even put on hold their offensive to the south of Bakhmut to be able to achieve anything to the north of Bakhmut. It is true that they have been successfully advancing in the region so far, but the fundamental reason for that lies in the topography of the region. After establishing control of the hills around Solidary, Russians were facing Ukrainian positions in the lowlands. But after taking control over the lowlands, Wagner once again have to fight uphill. And with the lower concentration of troops due to the stretched front line, the further they go, the harder it gets. And right now, we are at the point where Wagner forces are concentrated in the lowlands around Bakhmut, which opens a possibility for Ukrainians to attack and recapture the hills of Yakovlevka and Kozhumayka and engulf Wagner forces that are trying to engulf Bakhmut. Winning and losing is a fact inherent in the nature of war. Therefore, every army at war determines distance to victory through large and small gains and losses. Therefore, it is natural to gain territory after successful operations or lose territory after defeats. However, losing or gaining some territories can change the course of a war. For Ukraine, this is undoubtedly the Crimean Peninsula. In recent days, the Ukrainian army has carried out a series of attacks on the Crimean Peninsula. Ukraine is getting closer to its goal. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ukrainian leaders, landscape, and Ukrainian army have been aiming to push the Russian invaders out of the occupied territories as soon as possible and advance towards Crimea. The first year of the war is over and the Ukrainian army is very close to this goal. Because the landscape, his army and his people put up a great resistance against the invaders, despite the threats of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Ukrainian leader Zelensky has not backed down. The attacks on Sevastopol in Crimea the other day clearly showed the determination of Zelensky and the Ukrainian army. In almost every speech, Zelensky has said that Crimea will be taken from the Russian occupiers. In fact, Zelensky said that Russia's occupation of Ukraine began in 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea and continued with a full-scale occupation on February 24, 2022. Therefore, Zelensky said that the Russian-Ukrainian war started in Crimea and would end with the recapture of Crimea. Crimea, which Zelensky often reminded, has been the target of the Ukrainian army in recent days. The Ukrainian army has now crossed the occupied territories and is advancing to Crimea. Ukrainian drones hit Crimea the other day. After this attack on the port of Sevastopol in the morning, Kremlin issued an emergency alert. The day before the Ukrainian army drone strike, explosions also occurred in the Crimean city of Zonki. The railway supply line of the Russian occupiers in Zonki was hit during the delivery of Caliber missiles. Increasing activity in Crimea. Before analyzing the latest development in Sevastopol, Crimea, we will have a reminder as Anka Daily News team will continue to report all developments regarding the Russia-Ukraine war with our understanding of accurate and impartial journalism. We kindly ask you to click on the Super Thanks button to support our work and our team. Ukrainian army drones targeted Sevastopol in Crimea. The port city of Sevastopol is of great importance in the war. For this reason, the Ukrainian army also carried out attacks on the port of Sevastopol during the first year of the war. The attack carried out the other day was prevented by Russian forces. However, Ukrainian drones had hit so many points in Sevastopol port that Russia stopped sea transportation after the attack. The hit on the port of Sevastopol has unsettled Kremlin because the loss of this region means that Russia has failed in its invasion of Ukraine. If Ukraine liberates Crimea from the Russian occupiers, the war could spread to Russian territory at any moment. That is why Kremlin is trying very hard not to lose the Crimea region after the Ukrainian army's attack on Sevastopol. Many Russian and Ukrainian officials made statements in order to hide the defeat. Russia declared that the attack was repelled and no damage was done. Mikhail Raduyev, the occupying governor of Crimea, said about the Ukrainian army's attack, "Our fleet repelled a surface drone attack early this morning. They tried to enter the bay, but our Navy men opened fire on them. In addition, air defenses were engaged. 3 drones have been destroyed so far." Ukrainian officials also commented on the attack. Natalia Humeniuk, a spokesperson for Ukraine's Southern Operational Command, interpreted the Ukrainian army's attack as a signal for Russia to leave the Crimean Peninsula. Minutes later, it became clear that the statements of the occupying governor, Mikhail Raduyev, were untrue because the Ukrainian army, which was said to have been repulsed, attacked the South Bay area near the area where the Black Sea Fleet is anchored. No statement was made about the explosions in the South Bay area. Residents said the explosions were so violent that the windows of the famous Moscow House Cultural Center building located near the South Bay area exploded. It was stated that even the windows of houses located kilometers away from the explosion zone shook. Over the past 2 days, a series of explosions have taken place in Crimea. The Ukrainian army's attacks on Crimea have increased. The timing of the increased attacks in Crimea was very meaningful because the attacks increased after Russian leader Vladimir Putin's visit to Crimea. The timing of the increased attacks in Crimea was very meaningful because the attacks increased after Russian leader Vladimir Putin's visit to Crimea. Putin visited Crimea on the 9th anniversary of its annexation. Following this visit, there have been continuous explosions in Crimea. Russian leader Vladimir Putin's visit to Crimea has been on the agenda all over the world. There have been many discussions about this visit. It was claimed that Putin used a stunt double during his visit to Crimea. Putin's visit was interpreted by many commentators as Putin's appearance to hide the losses of the Russian army. But apart from all these allegations and debates, there was one clear fact. Putin was losing with his visit to Crimea. Putin tried to send messages that would conceal his decline against Ukraine and inhuman actions of the Russian army in the war. One of these messages was to the International Criminal Court. Recently, the International Criminal Court announced that Putin had illegally deported Ukrainian children from Ukrainian territory. It is also known that many Ukrainian children have been kidnapped by the Russian occupiers for these reasons. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Putin the day after this decision. Putin visited Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. A visit there was a reference to the International Criminal Court's decision. Russian leader Vladimir Putin was welcomed in Crimea by Mikhail Razvozhayev, the occupying governor of Sebastopol. Radovoyevich showed Putin around many regions in Crimea. The visit to Children's Center and Art School was one of the most noteworthy ones, with Russian officials described as a surprise visit. The Russian leader made a reference to the decision of the International Criminal Court. With his visit to the Children's Center, Russian leader Vladimir Putin is no longer successful, even though he makes visits and gives images to hide his losses at the front. Because the losses of the Russian army have become impossible to hide, the Russian army had to retreat from many regions. The army's military personnel and equipment problems are increasing day by day. The losses of the Russian army from the beginning of the war until today are as follows: 167,090 military personnel, 3,557 tanks, 6,887 armored combat vehicles, 2,589 artillery systems, 509 reactive spread fire system, 272 air defense systems, 305 aircraft, 290 helicopters, 5,434 automotive and tank equipment, 18 military ships and boats, 909 cruise missiles, 2,183 unmanned aerial vehicles, 270 special machines, and 4 operational tactical missile systems.